And then lastly, the disclosure rep. We call it a 10b5 rep, which I described a little bit earlier. It says, none of my reps and warranties and none of my statements in the disclosure schedules omits a material fact or fails to state a material fact necessary to make all of these reps true, complete. And that's a pretty broad representation warranty. In a few cases I've gotten it knocked out, but usually the buyer who's smart, who has good counsel, is going to ask for these types of reps and warranties. There are ways you can limit it, and I've tried to give you some suggestions on how you might do that. And it's not always the same rep. Different lawyers come up with different ways of constructing it. It's not always the same thing. There's no boilerplate in this area. It's creativity. And then making sure you read the language, interpret it, and figuring out what the downside of agreeing to it is, and trying to see if we can narrow the scope of it if we're representing the seller. Conditions and covenants. So if there's been a material breach of any rep between signing and closing, we got to notify the buyer. The seller has to notify them. And if they don't, that could be liability. If we do, it may give the buyer the ability to walk away from the transaction, a condition to closing. We're also going to say that all of our reps and warranties that we made on the date that we signed the agreement at closing are also true and accurate, so that nothing's changed in between them. But the biggest covenant that we see is the non-compete covenant in the purchase agreement. It may be a separate agreement, or it may be a covenant where the owners are bound to follow a non-compete prohibition contract. And the non-compete may be very, very broad, or it may be very, very narrow. Depends on how much is being paid in the transaction, how much they're getting out of this deal. Is it money that they can retire on and never have to worry about anything? And are other employees being asked to sign non-competes because of this purchase agreement? Because maybe they got a small piece of the consideration in the deal, maybe 1% or 2% of the acquisition price. Are they being asked to sign the non-compete that the 90% owners, well, the 90% owner may say, I'm not going to compete, I got my money, I'm walking away, I'm good. But the 1 or 2% person may need to make a living going forward. So you may need to segregate the non-compete language between those types of people, and you may want to negotiate, because the transaction in total may not be enough for the owner really to retire on. The owner may have to go back to work as well. It's just money that they can set aside and put away. So how do we protect the buyer from them losing their business, and how do we protect the seller from not being able to make a living? So it's a negotiation that goes on. In most cases, as the seller's counsel, I try to go to the buyer's counsel and say, look, you've paid us a reasonable amount for the business, depending on how much it is. Many of these people aren't going to compete. They don't compete in the first place. But others are right in the business. They're involved in the business on a day-to-day basis, and they need to go to work afterwards. Let's agree that we won't steal your employees and we won't steal your customers for a lengthy period of time. And let's define customers in a way that makes sense, so that it's not the entire Defense Department. Indemnification and liability. So in most transactions, majority of transactions, over $100 million, this recent study indicated about 52%, there is indemnification by the seller and the buyer of each other, but with baskets and caps. In 90% of the transactions, there's indemnification. What is indemnification? I hereby hold you harmless. I'm the seller, you're the buyer. I hold you harmless from liability for my breaches of my reps and my warranties and the covenants that you've laid out in my agreement. The buyer says, okay, I want it, for some things, I want it for the entire purchase price. And you say, well, wait a second, that's really harsh. So if I forget to tell you about a pencil that was on the table, and I don't disclose that, you're going to hold me liable for the entire purchase price? Well, no, just for the amount of the pencil. Well, that's ridiculous. That's nickel and diming. So, we get into this negotiation of there may be an amount that we lay out on the table that says any claim under a certain amount, the buyer is not going to even make a claim for. Might be 10,000, 15,000, 25,000, depending on the size of the deal. Any claim under that amount, we're just not even going to bother with. Any claim over that amount, we will have the right to make a claim on. But then the seller says, give me some flexibility here so that you're not, again, not nickel and diming me for small things, because even $25,000 in a $35 million a year business is really nickel and diming. Give me a deductible. Any claims over that amount, I'll pay you for. Any claims under that amount, you bear the risk of it. So we get into this negotiation and they say, no, I'll treat it as a tipping basket, says the buyer. The tipping basket is sort of like a deductible until you hit the deductible. And then if you hit the deductible, it tips back to $1. And we've gotten into permutations where it tips back to $5, $50, $1,000. You know, there are different ways of negotiating this, but from the seller's perspective, they want that deductible so that they're not worrying about nickel and diming, and they're making reps and warranties and giving indemnification on big ticket items. Big ticket items. Does that make sense? Questions on indemnification? Now, there are things called fundamental reps and non-fundamental reps. And there's something called fraud. When there's fraud, there's no limit on the amount of liability that may be associated with the claim from the buyer. It may be even greater than the purchase price. So when you're giving your reps and warranties, you better be darn sure that you know what you're saying. Fundamental reps, my company has the authority to enter into this transaction. The capitalization table that shows the amount of stock and options and phantom stock and everything else existing as of the closing is accurate, 100%. There's not somebody out there that I promised something in an email or in writing in the past that I was going to give them 5% of the company, and I never did. I've had that happen, and it held up closing, almost killed the deal in that particular instance, and it was a very big government contracting deal. We didn't find out about it until the last minute. But those are the things that are considered fundamental reps. Tax representations. The buyer wants protection from any kind of tax liability. ERISA, employee benefits. They want to make sure all the filings have been made on a timely basis. Indemnification and liability is absolutely critical as part of the negotiation, and it's a major part of the acquisition agreement. So these examples give you an idea of what I was talking about. No claim under $25,000, that's a de minimis amount. Purchase price is $30 million. We'll give them, the seller will get a basket of 500, but it tips back if it exceeds 500 to $1 or $2.50 or whatever. A deductible of 300 would give us the ability to avoid claims on the first 300. So we end up going back and forth with buyer's counsel to figure out what they're willing to do, what we're willing to do, and what our respective clients are willing to compromise on, understanding what the reps and warranties say. Cap on liability, limit the amount of the liability on the purchase price, and then fundamental reps obviously are unlimited.